Somewhere in your blood right now, there might be something missing, not damaged, not diseased, missing. A single protein that most humans carry on the surface of every red blood cell, and roughly 1 in 7 people on Earth simply don't have it. It's called Rh-negative blood, and by the normal rules of evolution, it shouldn't still exist. It makes pregnancy riskier. It complicates surgery. It can turn an emergency transfusion into a life or death guessing game. Traits that cause that much damage are supposed to get bred out, generation by generation, until they vanish. This one didn't. Almost 1 billion people carry it today. In a few places, more than 1 in 3 do. For most of the last century, doctors treated that as a footnote, a strange detail on a blood test, filed away and mostly ignored. Outside of medicine, though, people noticed the gap, and they filled it the way people always fill a real mystery, with a story. You've probably heard some version of it, that Rh-negative blood comes from somewhere else. Alien ancestry. A drowned civilization, a bloodline too strange to be entirely human. Type Rh-negative into a search bar, and you'll find all of it stacked on top of each other, told with total confidence. None of it is true. But the reason it isn't true turns out to be far more interesting than the myths themselves, because ancient DNA sequencing has finally caught up to this question. And in just the last couple of years, researchers have traced this bloodline back to an actual time, an actual place, and an actual group of people. Real humans, doing something remarkable that left a mark still readable in your blood today. It starts in a hospital in 1939 with a mystery nobody could explain. A woman had just delivered a stillborn baby, and when doctors gave her a transfusion using her own husband's blood that should have matched by every test available at the time, her body attacked it like an invader. 2 physicians, Philip Levine and Rufus Stetson, had a theory. There was some antigen in human blood nobody had found yet, and if a baby carried it and the mother didn't, her immune system could learn to treat that baby's blood as the enemy. A year later, Karl Landsteiner, already a Nobel laureate for discovering blood types A, B, and O back in 1901, set out to prove it. Landsteiner had already saved countless lives once, simply by figuring out why some transfusions worked and others killed the patient outright. Now he was chasing a second, subtler mismatch, one that ABO typing alone couldn't explain. His method was almost accidental. He and Alexander Wiener injected rhesus monkey blood into rabbits, harvested the antibodies those rabbits produced, then tested them against human blood. Most samples reacted. Some didn't react at all. The protein those antibodies were built to find simply wasn't there. They named it after the monkey. The rhesus factor. Rh positive if you had it, Rh negative if you didn't. It wasn't a disease, it was an absence. And it split humanity into 2 biological camps almost overnight. The consequences were brutal, and for decades there was nothing anyone could do about them. Here's the mechanism, in plain terms. If an Rh-negative mother carries an Rh-positive baby, some of that baby's blood mixes into hers, usually during birth. Her immune system meets that protein for the first time and builds a defense against it. Antibodies, just like it would for a virus. The first pregnancy is almost always fine. It's the second Rh-positive pregnancy that turns dangerous because now her body remembers, and those antibodies cross into the next baby and start destroying its blood cells before it's even born. Doctors call it hemolytic disease of the newborn. For most of human history, it had no name at all, just a quiet, recurring pattern of stillbirths and brain damage that nobody could trace back to its cause. A fix didn't exist until 1968, a shot called Rogam, given to Rh-negative mothers to stop that immune attack before it starts. It's one of the quieter medical triumphs of the last century, but global health researchers estimate that hundreds of thousands of pregnancies are still affected by Rh incompatibility every year, concentrated heavily in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, where that shot isn't consistently available. One widely cited model puts the yearly toll at somewhere over 100,000 deaths or serious injuries, almost all of it preventable. The science has existed for more than 50 years. Access simply hasn't caught up to it. Even in wealthier countries, the fix has kept evolving. Doctors used to give every Rh-negative mother the shot automatically, just in case. Now, in a growing number of countries, a simple blood draw from the mother can read fragments of the baby's own DNA floating in her bloodstream and determine its Rh status months before birth. No needle near the baby required. It sounds almost mundane compared to everything else in this story. It isn't. It means a problem that once killed silently for the entire span of human history can now sometimes be solved with a single lab test before the mother even feels the first kick. So here's the actual puzzle. Not the alien one, the real one, and it's stranger than it sounds. Evolution doesn't do sentiment. A trait that raises your odds of losing a child should get erased fast over enough generations. Hemolytic disease did exactly that kind of damage for tens of thousands of years with zero medicine available anywhere on Earth. And the mutation behind Rh-negative blood, a small deletion that quietly switches off one gene, should have been wiped out a long time ago. It wasn't. In the Basque Country, it sits at more than double the global average. Something kept it alive. For most of the 20th century, the leading guess was that Rh-negative blood must come with some hidden upside, a disease resistance powerful enough to outweigh all those deaths. It's a good story. In 2012, a team led by geneticist George Perry actually went looking for the genetic fingerprint that kind of advantage would leave behind. They didn't find one. No sign that natural selection was rewarding this trait at all, which means something else was keeping it alive. And the real explanation turns out to be less about superpowers and more about migration. Picture Ice Age Europe. Small, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers spread thin across the continent, many of them likely carrying the Rh-negative version of the gene at high rates. In some regions, possibly the majority version. Then, starting around 7,000 years ago, farmers began arriving from the direction of Anatolia, spreading across the continent and almost everywhere, gradually replacing the older population's genetics with their own, genetics that leaned heavily Rh-positive. Wherever the two groups mixed evenly over the following generations, Rh-negative frequency settled somewhere in the middle. Wherever an older population held its ground and never fully blended in, the original higher frequency survived largely intact. It's an idea the geneticist J.B.S. Haldane floated back in 1942, decades before anyone had the tools to test it directly. Ancient DNA finally gave researchers those tools, and the mixing theory has held up far better than the hidden superpower one ever did. Which brings us to the one place on Earth where that story is written in the most extreme numbers imaginable. Tucked into the mountains between Spain and France is a population that has never quite fit the rest of Europe's story. The Basques speak Euskera, a language with no confirmed relatives anywhere on the planet. Not Latin, not Celtic, not part of the Indo-European family that swallowed nearly every other tongue on the continent. Linguists call it an isolate, and their blood tells a matching story. Global Rh-negative frequency runs around 15%. In the Basque Country, it climbs to 30, sometimes 35%, the highest sustained rate recorded anywhere on Earth. Ancient DNA work, some of it tied to Harvard geneticist David Reich's lab, shows why. Basque ancestry traces back with unusual continuity to the hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Iberia. When farmers swept through the rest of Europe 7,000 years ago, the Basques barely absorbed them. The Pyrenees made a difficult place to invade or settle, and the language itself likely reinforced the boundary, discouraging intermarriage with newcomers for thousands of years. Geneticists have a term for what that produces. A refugium, a pocket where an older population survives almost untouched while the world around it gets overwritten. The Basque Country isn't a genetic mystery. It's closer to a time capsule. It shows up in other ways too. Basque blood is overwhelmingly type O and type B, common across much of Asia and the Middle East, carried there by later migrations, is almost absent in traditional Basque villages. Geneticists treat that absence the same way they treat the high Rh-negative rate, not as something mystical, but as a fingerprint of just how little outside blood ever mixed in. There's a frozen confirmation of exactly how old that population really is. In 1991, hikers in the Alps found a mummified body that turned out to be over 5,000 years old, Ötzi the Iceman. When his genome was finally sequenced, it carried genetic echoes of the same pre-farming European population the Basques still connect to today. A direct snapshot of the continent before agriculture rewrote it. Zoom out from the Basques, though, and the global map stops making tidy sense. Western Europe generally sits between 15 and 30% Rh-negative, spiking in Ireland and Scotland as well as the Basque Country. North African Berber populations run high too, and so do some Bedouin communities in the Sinai, along with certain Jewish and Arab communities across the Middle East. Then cross into East Asia, and the number falls off a cliff, under 1%. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's under 0.5%. In Japan, where blood type is taken seriously enough to show up in personality quizzes and dating profiles, Rh-negative people are so rare that they're sometimes treated as exotic outsiders. A purely cultural belief, worth mentioning only because it shows how differently the same biology gets read depending on where you're standing. And then there's the anomaly nobody has fully explained. Certain indigenous groups in North America, the Blackfoot and Blood tribes, show Rh-negative rates climbing back up toward 10%. On a world map, that number shouldn't be there. Their ancestors, by every standard migration model, crossed into the Americas from Siberia through Beringia tens of thousands of years ago, and Beringia sits right next to the part of the world where Rh-negative blood is almost non-existent today. So how does a population descended from that route end up with a frequency closer to Western Europe's than to Japan's or China's? Nobody has a clean answer for that yet. It could be genetic drift acting on a small founding population, the same kind of statistical fluke that shaped the Basques. It could be something in the historical record nobody has fully reconstructed. Either way, it's one of the honest loose threads left in this field, and we don't know yet, is still a real answer in science, even when it's not a satisfying one. So if it wasn't selection, and it wasn't some ice age crisis in Europe, where did this deletion actually begin? The answer only arrived in January 2025, and it points somewhere almost nobody was looking. A team led by geneticist Stéphane Mazière at Aix-Marseille University traced the origin of these blood variants with more precision than any study before it. Their starting clue was simple. The gene variants behind the modern Rh system are almost completely absent in African populations, but common in some places close to 40%. Everywhere else, if the mutation had first appeared in Africa and spread outward, you'd expect to find at least a trace of it left behind. There basically isn't one. That rules out an African origin. It also rules out something people have assumed for years, that we picked this up by interbreeding with Neanderthals or Denisovans. Their ancient genomes have been checked. Neither species carries these variants either. What the evidence does show is a group of early Homo sapiens who left Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago, and then, instead of spreading straight across Eurasia, appear to have paused for something like 15 to 20,000 years on the Persian Plateau, a stretch of land across modern Iran, southeastern Iraq, and northeastern Saudi Arabia. Multiple independent studies now point to this same population as the shared ancestor of nearly everyone who eventually settled Europe, Asia, and the Americas. It looks like this was where the Rh variants first took shape. Not during some desperate ice age crisis, and not from crossbreeding with another human species, but during an ordinary, stable, multi-thousand-year pause long before anyone had even reached Europe. And this is the part that quietly kills off the myths from the start of this video. There's no room in this timeline for ancient astronauts engineering a bloodline, and no drowned civilization required to explain it either. The dating alone rules them out. This wasn't a sudden event. It wasn't recent. It was ordinary genetic variation, arising in an ordinary population, tens of thousands of years before anyone was writing anything down anywhere. The truth didn't need to be exotic. It just needed to be old enough and specific enough that nobody had been able to see it clearly until now. There's one myth left standing, though, and it's not just wrong, it's backwards. You'll hear constantly that Rh negative blood is a Neanderthal inheritance. It isn't. Sequenced Neanderthal genomes show they were uniformly Rh positive. And in a separate 2025 study, researchers proposed something closer to the opposite of the myth, that when Neanderthals and modern humans did interbreed, Rh incompatibility between Neanderthal mothers and Rh negative human fathers may have quietly reduced the survival of some of those hybrid pregnancies. One small thread, among many, in the story of why Neanderthals didn't make it and we did. That doesn't mean every advantage theory is dead, though. One is genuinely still standing, even if it's smaller than the myth makes it sound. A Czech biologist named Jaroslav Flieger has spent years studying Toxoplasma gondii, a parasite roughly a third of the world carries, usually from undercooked meat or contact with cats. Once it's in the brain, it seems to quietly slow reaction time, measured in fractions of a second, the kind of delay that wouldn't matter much crossing a modern street, but could matter enormously if you were, say, a Paleolithic hunter reacting to a predator or a threat, a half second too late. Flieger's team found that Rh-positive people infected with the parasite showed measurably slower reflexes than uninfected people, while Rh-negative people appeared largely protected from that same slowdown. It's real, published, peer-reviewed work. It's also come out of essentially one research group on one fairly narrow measurement, and it hasn't been independently replicated at scale. Treat it the way good science treats it, a genuinely interesting lead. Not proof that this blood type exists to save you from a parasite. Other claims fall apart faster. You'll hear that Rh-negative people are disproportionately redheaded, tied to a gene called MC1R. What's actually happening is simpler. Red hair and Rh-negative blood are both just more common in the same corner of Europe, Ireland, Scotland, the old Celtic fringe, because both trace back to the same isolated ancestral populations. Two unrelated traits showing up in the same people isn't the same as one causing the other, and there's no known mechanism linking them. Then there's blue blood. The phrase really does come from medieval Spain, where pale aristocrats could see their veins more clearly and use that as proof of an unmixed bloodline. That part checks out. What doesn't check out is the modern claim that European royal families were secretly concentrating Rh-negative blood through generations of inbreeding. What their inbreeding definitely did concentrate, and this part is extremely well documented, was hemophilia, a completely different, unrelated condition, carried on the X chromosome and traced famously through Queen Victoria's descendants into the Russian and Spanish royal houses. It's a real story about the cost of dynastic intermarriage. It just isn't this story. Strip out the parts that don't hold up, and what's left is more interesting than the version with aliens in it, mostly because it isn't finished yet, and because it's still, quietly, a matter of life and death. About 7% of people carry O-negative blood. The universal donor type, the one hospitals reach for in an emergency when there's no time to test someone's blood group first. Trauma units, battlefield medicine, disaster response, all of it depends on a supply blood banks routinely describe as days from running dry. That's not a historical detail. That's true this week, wherever you're watching this. And at the far edge of this same biology sits something even rarer. Retinal blood, sometimes called golden blood, because it's compatible with almost nobody, and almost nobody is compatible with it. Fewer than 50 people on the planet are known to carry it. It's blood missing the entire Rh antigen system, every version of it, not just the one this video has been talking about. It's valuable enough that some carriers travel internationally just to donate for research. And it's genuinely dangerous to live with, because if one of them ever needs a transfusion in an emergency, there's almost no compatible blood anywhere on Earth to give them. And the story is still adding chapters. Research published during the COVID-19 pandemic found modest differences in infection outcomes tied to blood type, including Rh status. One small piece of a much larger, still unfolding field studying how blood group genetics shapes our relationship with disease. Not settled, just live, and being worked on right now. If you've ever taken a consumer DNA test, your Rh status is already sitting somewhere in that data, usually buried a few menus deep, next to your ancestry breakdown and your distant cousin matches. Most people never open that particular tab. After today, you might. So here's where the evidence actually leaves us. This deletion most likely first appeared in a population resting on a plateau in what's now Iran, sometime between 45 and 70,000 years ago, long before Europe had a single human in it. It has nothing to do with Neanderthals, and if it connects to them at all, it may run the opposite way from the myth. It spread unevenly from there, staying highest wherever isolated populations, like the Basques, held onto older lineages instead of blending into the waves that reshaped everyone around them. And it survived most likely, not because of some hidden power, but through the plain mechanics of migration and isolation, with a couple of real, open questions, like the toxoplasma finding and the Blackfoot anomaly, still sitting on the table exactly where honest science leaves them. Notice what actually happened here, too. Nobody had to invent anything to make this story compelling. For decades, the honest answer was just, we don't know. And that gap is exactly what let the myths move in. Because a mystery left open long enough always gets filled with something, and it's rarely the truth. What finally closed the gap wasn't speculation. It was better data, ancient genomes, larger sample sizes, sharper statistical tools, researchers willing to go back and test ideas that had been sitting untested since the 1940s. That's a slower, less cinematic process than an ancient astronaut story. It's also the only process that's ever actually gotten anyone closer to what's true. That's not a smaller story than the one about lost civilizations. It's a bigger one, because it actually happened to real people in real places, and the trace of it is still sitting in your blood right now, whether or not anyone ever tells you about it. If you're Rh negative, you're not carrying a signal from somewhere else, and you're not descended from something other than human. You're carrying one of the clearest, most literal records of deep human history that still exists on this planet. A story written not in stone, not in any language, but in a single protein your body simply never learned to make. It's been there the whole time. Now you know why.